There's a moment most men never talk about. Everything is going well, the mood is right, the connection feels real. And then without warning, it's gone. Not gradually, just gone. And in that silence, something shifts inside a man that goes far beyond the physical. It touches confidence, identity, and self-worth in ways that are difficult to put into words. If that moment is familiar to you, this video is going to change how you understand your own body, because here's what almost nobody tells you. Losing an erection during sex is not a failure of desire. It is not a sign of weakness, and in many cases it is not even primarily a sexual problem. It is a signal, a precise biological signal that something in your vascular system, your nervous system, or your hormonal environment is asking for attention. And once you understand what that signal actually means, you gain something far more powerful than a quick fix. You gain real, lasting control. Over the next several minutes, you're going to discover exactly why this happens. From the neurological chemistry behind arousal to the cardiovascular mechanics of maintaining an erection, and more importantly, what evidence-based science says you can actually do about it. Stay through to the end, because the information in the final section is the part most men never hear, and it's the part that makes the biggest difference. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand why an erection disappears, you first need to understand the extraordinary biological process that creates one. Most people assume an erection is a simple hydraulic event. Blood goes in, it gets hard. But that description barely scratches the surface. What actually happens in your body when you become aroused is one of the most precisely coordinated vascular and neurological events in human physiology. And when you see how many moving parts are involved, it stops being surprising that things sometimes go wrong. What becomes surprising is how often they go right. When arousal begins, whether triggered by touch, visual stimulation, thought, or emotional connection, your brain activates a branch of your autonomic nervous system called the parasympathetic system. This is the calm, restorative side of your nervous system, the part responsible for healing, digestion, and yes, sexual function. It sends signals traveling down through your spinal cord and into the pelvic nerve network, ultimately reaching the smooth muscle cells that line the interior walls of the blood vessels inside your penis. These nerve signals trigger the release of a molecule called nitric oxide. And this is where the story gets fascinating, because nitric oxide is not just a chemical in this process. It is the master key. It is the molecule that tells the arterial walls to relax, to widen, to open up and allow a surge of blood to flow into two cylindrical chambers inside the penis called the corpora cavernosa. These chambers are sponge-like structures that expand and become rigid as blood pressure inside them rises. But here's the part of the equation that most people have never heard of, and it matters enormously. For an erection to be maintained, it's not enough for blood to flow in. The veins that would normally carry blood back out of the penis must simultaneously compress and close. There are tiny valve-like mechanisms in the outflow veins that seal off under pressure, trapping the blood inside. It's this trapping mechanism, this venous occlusion, that creates the firmness and sustains it. Arterial inflow and venous closure working in perfect synchrony. One without the other produces an incomplete result. Now here's what changes with age, and this is something the research makes unmistakably clear. As men get older, the endothelial cells, the cells that line the inner surface of your blood vessels, become less efficient at producing nitric oxide. Studies have demonstrated that between the ages of 40 and 70, nitric oxide bioavailability in the vascular system can decline by as much as 50%. Half. That's not a marginal shift. That's a fundamental change in how your arteries receive and respond to the signals your nervous system is sending them. What this means practically is that the open up and let blood in message your pelvic nerves are sending is arriving, but the blood vessels are responding more slowly, less completely, and less sustainably. The arterial dilation is reduced. The pressure inside the corpora cavernosa doesn't reach the same level it once did. and the venous occlusion that should hold everything in place becomes less reliable. This is what clinicians sometimes call venous leakage, a condition where the outflow valves don't seal completely, allowing blood to gradually escape the erectile chambers even during arousal. It's not dramatic. It's not a rupture or a sudden event. It's a slow, quiet loss of pressure, and from the outside, it looks exactly like an erection that simply fades away mid-intercourse. Understanding this mechanism is the first step, because it tells you that what you're experiencing is not a malfunction of desire. It's a cardiovascular and molecular challenge, and that means it can be approached systematically with real science. So what triggers this in the moment, beyond the long-term vascular changes? This is where the story gets more layered, because there are 7 distinct categories of reasons men lose their erection during sex, and most men are dealing with more than one of them simultaneously without even knowing it. The first is purely mechanical and gravity-related, and it's one of the most overlooked factors in all of sexual medicine. The position of your body during intercourse directly affects hemodynamics, the physics of how blood moves through your vessels. Certain positions, particularly those where you are lying flat on your back, allow gravitational forces to work against the maintenance of penile blood pressure. When your body is horizontal and the mechanics of your vascular system are already slightly compromised, that gravitational pull can tip the balance. For men with any degree of venous leakage, this is often the invisible reason why erections feel harder to maintain in some positions than others. Positions that align with gravity, standing, kneeling, or allowing a partner to be on top, can make a measurable physiological difference. The second reason is neurological and psychological, and research consistently places it at the center of erectile dysfunction cases, particularly in men under 50. Your brain is not a passive observer during sexual activity. It is an active, continuous participant. And the branch of your nervous system that controls erection, the parasympathetic branch, is extraordinarily sensitive to mental interference. When the mind introduces a competing narrative, worry about performance, self-consciousness about the body, anxiety about a previous episode of erection loss, it activates the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight branch. This is the system designed for emergencies, and one of its immediate responses is to redirect blood flow away from non-essential functions. Sexual function is, from a survival standpoint, non-essential. So blood moves to your muscles, your heart rate increases, your arteries constrict, and the delicate parasympathetic cascade needed for erection maintenance gets interrupted. What makes this particularly challenging is the feedback loop it creates. A man loses his erection once. The memory of that moment generates anxiety the next time. That anxiety triggers the sympathetic response, and the sympathetic response causes another loss. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Research published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine has confirmed that psychological factors, especially performance anxiety, are among the strongest predictors of recurring erectile dysfunction, regardless of underlying physical health. The third reason relates to sensory decline, and it's something very few men connect to their sexual experience. Penile sensitivity is not static across a lifetime. The nerve endings responsible for transmitting tactile sensation from the penis to the brain become less efficient over time. Scientific literature has documented decreases in penile sensitivity of up to 30% between the ages of 40 and 70. This decline is accelerated in men with metabolic conditions like diabetes or cardiovascular disease that affects peripheral circulation. Why does sensitivity matter for maintaining an erection? Because the nervous system relies on continuous sensory feedback to sustain the arousal loop. Touch and stimulation send signals back to the brain that reinforce and perpetuate the parasympathetic response. When that sensory input is diminished, the brain receives weaker signals and the neurological reinforcement of the erection becomes less robust. It can fade simply from insufficient stimulation feedback, even when desire is completely present. The fourth reason connects directly to arousal as a cognitive and emotional process, not just a physical one. There is a distinction in neuroscience between peripheral arousal, physical sensation, and central arousal, mental and emotional engagement. Both are necessary for sustained erectile function. When a man is physically present in a sexual encounter but mentally disengaged, distracted by stress, emotional distance from a partner, depression, or environmental factors, the brain does not generate the full neurochemical cascade needed to sustain arousal. Dopamine, oxytocin, and norepinephrine all play roles in maintaining the motivational and neurological architecture of sexual engagement. If the central arousal component is weak, the physical response will be incomplete regardless of how much physical stimulation is occurring. The fifth reason is the self-fulfilling dimension of performance anxiety, which deserves its own discussion because it operates differently from ordinary psychological stress. Performance anxiety in the context of sexual function is not simply a matter of nervousness. It is a conditioned neurological response. Once the brain has associated a sexual encounter with the experience of erection loss, it begins to anticipate that outcome. This anticipation alone, before any physical event, generates a sympathetic nervous system response. The anxiety arrives before the moment, priming the body for failure before the encounter even begins. Breaking this cycle requires more than willpower. It requires deliberate strategic approaches to retraining how the nervous system responds to sexual context. The sixth reason is cardiovascular, and this is perhaps the most medically significant item on this list. The erectile tissue inside the penis contains some of the smallest arteries in the entire human body. These microscopic vessels are among the first to show signs of endothelial dysfunction, arterial stiffness, and atherosclerotic narrowing. Research published in the American Journal of Cardiology established a clinically significant finding. Erectile dysfunction often precedes the diagnosis of coronary artery disease by 3 to 5 years. This means the penis, in a very real medical sense, can serve as an early warning instrument for systemic cardiovascular health. When erections become unreliable, the question worth asking is not just, what's happening with my sexual function, but what is my vascular system trying to tell me about my overall health? Hypertension reduces arterial flexibility. High cholesterol contributes to plaque buildup in the penile arteries. Diabetes damages both the endothelium and the peripheral nerves simultaneously. All of these conditions impair the two-part mechanism, arterial dilation and venous occlusion, that erections depend on. And because the penile arteries are smaller, they show this damage sooner. The seventh reason is hormonal, and it operates both directly and indirectly across every other factor on this list. Testosterone is not simply the hormone of desire. It plays a structural and functional role in erectile tissue health. It supports the maintenance of the smooth muscle cells inside the corpora cavernosa. It preserves the sensitivity of penile nerve endings. It regulates the density of nitric oxide receptors in the vascular endothelium. And it maintains libido, the psychological drive that generates the central arousal necessary for sustained erectile function. Testosterone levels begin declining in men at approximately 1% per year after age 30. By age 50, many men are operating with testosterone levels 20 to 30% below their peak. This decline is gradual and often unnoticed until its cumulative effects become apparent. And those effects include not just reduced desire, but measurably weaker erections, slower arousal response, and decreased penile sensitivity, often all three simultaneously. Now that you understand what's actually happening across these 7 dimensions, the question becomes, what does the evidence say you can do about it? The first and simplest intervention is also one that is almost never discussed in popular health content. Emptying your bladder completely before sexual activity is not trivial advice. The bladder sits directly adjacent to the pelvic nerve network that governs erection. When the bladder is full, it creates physical pressure on these nerves and can impair their ability to transmit arousal signals efficiently. This is basic anatomy with real functional implications. The second intervention involves position strategy, which, as discussed earlier, has genuine hemodynamic significance. Choosing positions that use gravity constructively, where blood is mechanically assisted in filling and remaining in the erectile chambers, can meaningfully support erection maintenance, particularly for men with any degree of venous leakage. This isn't a workaround. It's working with your physiology rather than against it. The third intervention is extending the duration and quality of foreplay, and the reasoning behind this recommendation is more nuanced than it might appear. Longer foreplay does not just increase arousal for your partner, it also increases systemic arousal for you, building the neurochemical momentum needed to sustain parasympathetic dominance once intercourse begins. It also reduces the duration of time you need to maintain an erection during penetration, which reduces the pressure on the vascular mechanism. This combination makes erection maintenance significantly easier for men whose vascular response is somewhat compromised. The fourth intervention addresses something many men overlook entirely. Alcohol is widely perceived as a social and sexual lubricant, but its physiological effects directly contradict its reputation. Ethanol is a central nervous system depressant. Even moderate consumption impairs the neurological reflexes that govern erection. It causes systemic vasodilation that reduces the specific controlled vascular events needed for erectile function. It disrupts the nitric oxide pathway. And it causes dehydration, which reduces circulating blood volume. Clinical research has measured reductions in erectile function of up to 25% following moderate alcohol consumption. The cultural narrative around alcohol and sex is, physiologically speaking, backwards. The fifth intervention involves understanding the neurochemical recovery cycle following ejaculation. After orgasm, the body undergoes what's called the refractory period, a neurochemical reset during which neurotransmitters, hormones, and energy substrates are rebuilt. For men in their 40s and beyond, this period is longer than it was in earlier decades. Men who are sexually active multiple times within a short window, daily or every other day, may find that each subsequent encounter shows reduced erectile quality, not because of psychological disinterest, but because the neurochemical substrate hasn't fully rebuilt. Strategic spacing of sexual activity, allowing the body's chemistry to recover, can produce noticeably improved erectile quality. This is not a permanent restriction, it's temporary calibration. The sixth intervention is the use of a constriction ring, a device that receives far less clinical attention than it deserves in mainstream health conversations. By applying gentle, controlled pressure at the base of the penis, a constriction ring mechanically assists venous occlusion, the very process that becomes impaired with venous leakage. For men whose primary challenge is blood escaping too quickly from the erectile chambers, this device addresses the mechanism directly. It is safe when used correctly. It requires no prescription, and research supports its effectiveness as an adjunct to other erectile health strategies. The seventh and most comprehensive intervention involves long-term vascular and hormonal optimization, the kind of systemic approach that addresses the root biological mechanisms rather than managing symptoms moment to moment. This begins with cardiovascular health. Regular aerobic exercise, particularly the kind that elevates heart rate and demands vascular adaptability, has been shown in multiple studies to improve endothelial nitric oxide production, reduce arterial stiffness, and enhance overall erectile function. This isn't correlation. Exercise literally upregulates the enzymatic pathway that synthesizes nitric oxide in your blood vessel walls. Nutrition plays a parallel role. Diets high in nitrate-rich vegetables, dark leafy greens, beets, arugula, provide dietary precursors to nitric oxide synthesis. Mediterranean-style eating patterns have been associated in longitudinal studies with significantly lower rates of erectile dysfunction compared to Western dietary patterns. The vascular benefits of these foods are measurable, specific, and documented. Beyond diet and exercise, specific natural compounds have accumulated genuine clinical research supporting their effects on erectile vascular health. French maritime pine bark extract, derived from the bark of Pinus pinister, has been studied for its ability to enhance nitric oxide bioavailability and improve endothelial function. A study published in the Journal of Cardiovascular Pharmacology found that this compound improved vascular markers in men with endothelial dysfunction, with implications for both arterial dilation and venous sufficiency. L-arginine, an amino acid, serves as a direct precursor to nitric oxide synthesis and has been studied extensively in combination with other vascular compounds. Pomegranate extract contains ellagic acid and anthocyanins that protect nitric oxide from oxidative degradation, essentially preserving the nitric oxide your body produces rather than allowing it to be destroyed before it can act. These are not exotic supplements promoted on the fringe of the internet. They are compounds with peer-reviewed research, mechanisms of action that align with what we understand about erectile physiology, and growing clinical use among practitioners who work in men's vascular and sexual health. The eighth dimension of intervention addresses the sensitivity decline that contributes to the sensory feedback loop problem. Optimizing testosterone is the foundational step here because testosterone directly maintains the health of penile nerve endings and the density of nitric oxide receptors in erectile tissue. Beyond hormonal optimization, research has explored the use of controlled vibratory stimulation, not as a gimmick, but as a neurological tool. Studies have shown that mechanical vibration applied to penile tissue can stimulate local nitric oxide production and improve peripheral nerve conduction. This is used in clinical settings for men with neurological erectile dysfunction and is an area of active research. Simultaneously, systemic improvements in circulation through exercise, nutrition, nitric oxide support, and cardiovascular health create an environment where peripheral nerve health is sustained rather than continuing to decline. Now here's something worth sitting with as this video comes to a close. The experience of losing an erection during sex is one of the most privately carried burdens in men's health. It rarely gets discussed with friends. It rarely gets brought up with a doctor unless the situation has become severe. And in that silence, men often internalize the experience as something fundamentally wrong with who they are, a failure of masculinity, vitality, or desirability. But what you now understand is that this experience is a physiological event rooted in measurable, addressable mechanisms: nitric oxide decline, venous insufficiency, venous, sympathetic nervous system interference, sensory feedback reduction, hormonal shifts, cardiovascular, microvascular changes. These are not character flaws. They are biological processes that exist on a spectrum, respond to intervention, and are present in some degree in nearly every man who lives long enough. The body is not betraying you. It is communicating with you. The question is whether you choose to listen with curiosity and take informed action, or continue suffering in silence because no one has ever explained it this clearly before. Your sexual health is inseparable from your cardiovascular health, your hormonal health, your neurological health, and your psychological well-being. When you invest in one, you are investing in all of them. The man who approaches this with honesty, with a willingness to understand his own physiology, and with the patience to make genuine changes, that man gets his confidence back. Not because he was given a magic solution, but because he finally understood what his body needed all along. Take that seriously. You've earned it.